August 1944, Camp Crossville, Tennessee. Unteroffizier Werner Müller stood in the camp workshop staring at what appeared to be an ordinary wooden radio cabinet that prisoners were constructing as part of authorized furniture-making activities. What the American guards didn't know was that hidden inside the cabinet framework, concealed within false backs and double walls, German engineers were assembling a fully functional shortwave receiver using components scavenged from camp electrical systems, parts smuggled from work details, and materials obtained through elaborate trading networks. The radio would be operational within 3 weeks. It would receive BBC broadcasts, German propaganda from Berlin, and Allied news reports. It would provide intelligence that no amount of American censorship could suppress.
And the American camp commander would remain completely unaware of its existence for 7 months. Think about that. Enemy soldiers held in supposedly secure prison camps were constructing sophisticated communications equipment under the direct supervision of guards who saw nothing suspicious. But the secret radio represented only one element of a parallel society that German POWs were building behind barbed wire. A shadow civilization that included orchestras performing Beethoven and Wagner, baseball teams competing in organized leagues, newspapers published in German with readership in the thousands, educational programs offering university-level courses, elaborate escape tunnel systems that required engineering precision,
and internal command structures that maintained military discipline despite American attempts to dismantle hierarchy. The Americans believed they controlled the camps, they controlled the perimeter. Inside the wire, Germans governed themselves according to principles that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't witnessed it directly. What the Americans didn't know was that German military culture didn't cease at the moment of surrender. It transformed, it adapted. It found expression through channels that appeared completely harmless to guards who saw only recreational activities and productive labor. What the Americans didn't know was that inside camps housing over 370,000 German prisoners across the United States, a complete society was functioning with newspapers, courts, schools, orchestras, theaters, sports leagues, and command structures that rivaled the organization of many American towns. What the Americans didn't know was that some of the most elaborate infrastructure being built by prisoners, the concert halls, the baseball diamonds, the workshop facilities, served dual purposes that guards couldn't detect without specialized knowledge of German military culture. Within 2 years, this shadow civilization would produce cultural achievements that amazed even the Americans who eventually discovered them. Symphony orchestras performing at professional levels, newspapers with circulation exceeding 10,000 copies, educational programs producing graduates who would use their prison camp education to rebuild Germany after the war. The story of what German POWs built behind barbed wire reveals something profound about human nature under constraint. Given tools, materials, and time, determined people will create civilization anywhere, even in captivity, especially in captivity, because building something, anything, proves you remain human despite circumstances designed to reduce you to mere numbers. June 1943. The first German POWs arrived at Camp Crossville in June 1943 after transport from North Africa through processing facilities in Virginia. They expected nothing beyond survival. What they received was opportunity disguised as boredom. The camp commander, Colonel Harold Martin, operated according to Geneva Convention requirements that permitted various activities for prisoner welfare and morale. Recreational activities were authorized. Educational programs were permitted, cultural activities were encouraged, labor was allowed for non-military purposes. Colonel Martin believed that keeping prisoners productively occupied would reduce escape attempts, minimize disciplinary problems, and create a more manageable camp environment. He was correct about the first two assumptions, and completely wrong about what productivity would actually mean. Within 2 weeks of arrival, German prisoners had submitted formal requests through proper channels for permission to establish a camp orchestra, organize sports competitions, publish a camp newspaper, and establish workshop facilities for furniture construction and repair. Colonel Martin approved all requests. They seemed harmless, recreational activities that would keep prisoners busy and satisfied. What Colonel Martin didn't know was that each approved activity created infrastructure that Germans would use for purposes that went far beyond entertainment. The orchestra permission created legitimate need for musical instruments. Instruments required maintenance. Maintenance required tools. Tools could be adapted for other purposes that had nothing to do with music. The sports competitions required fields to be constructed, equipment to be manufactured, and scheduling systems to be established. These created legitimate movement patterns within the camp, established routines that guards came to ignore, and developed organizational structures that appeared recreational but served command purposes. The newspaper permission required printing equipment, paper supplies, ink, and distribution systems. These resources created communication networks that could be used for purposes beyond official publication. The workshop permission provided legitimate access to woodworking tools, metal implements, electrical wiring, and various materials that could be repurposed for applications that American guards would never imagine. By August 1943, 3 months after arrival, Camp Crossville had approved infrastructure for orchestra, newspaper, workshops, sports leagues, and educational programs. The Germans had everything they needed to build their shadow society. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, a former electrical engineer from Siemens who had been captured in Tunisia, surveyed the approved activities with professional assessment. He later wrote in a letter that passed censorship because censors couldn't recognize the significance. Every permission they grant us becomes a tool. They think they're allowing recreation. We're building infrastructure. The first major construction project began in September 1943 when prisoners requested permission to build a proper concert hall for the orchestra that had been practicing in a mess hall. The Americans approved the request. It seemed reasonable. Good for morale. Evidence of humane treatment that could be reported to the International Red Cross. Prisoners submitted architectural plans that showed a simple wooden structure with raised platform for performers, seating for audience, and adequate acoustics. The plans were professionally drawn by former architects who understood exactly what they were doing. What the plans didn't show was that the hall's design included numerous hidden spaces suitable for concealing contraband, that the acoustic requirements created legitimate need for complex internal construction that would make future modifications undetectable, and that the raised platform area would provide perfect access to underfloor spaces suitable for various purposes. Construction began in October 1943. American guards supervised the work, ensuring that no security violations occurred and that construction proceeded according to approved plans. They saw prisoners building exactly what had been authorized, a concert hall for music performances. Construction was completed in January 1944. The first concert was held in February, featuring works by Beethoven, Mozart, and Wagner, performed by an orchestra of 45 musicians. American officers attended. The performance quality was surprisingly professional. Colonel Martin wrote in his report that the cultural development of prisoners exceeded expectations and demonstrated the effectiveness of humane treatment. What Colonel Martin didn't notice was that during construction, prisoners had created false walls that concealed storage spaces, had installed removable floor panels that provided access to large underfloor areas, and had designed acoustic panels that could be temporarily removed to allow access to spaces behind walls. The concert hall had been built as designed. It just had additional features that weren't on submitted plans. The secret radio project began in March 1944 when Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, a signals officer who had operated communications equipment throughout the North Africa campaign, recognized an opportunity in the camp's electrical system. Camp Crossville, like all major POW facilities, had been electrified completely. Every barrack had lighting, the workshops had power tools, the mess halls had electric equipment. Electricity was everywhere, maintained by both American personnel and prisoner work details who had electrical knowledge. Weber had been assigned to a work detail that performed electrical maintenance under American supervision. This provided legitimate access to the camp's entire electrical infrastructure, to spare parts kept in maintenance storage, and to technical information about how the system functioned. Weber studied the system for 2 weeks before concluding that components for a shortwave radio receiver could be acquired gradually through careful acquisition that wouldn't trigger American suspicion. The key was patience and distribution of acquisition across multiple sources. He began in April 1944. One resistor taken from a box of spare parts that contained hundreds. One capacitor removed from a broken electric fan awaiting repair. One wire segment cut from stock that maintenance kept for various projects. One tube acquired when a batch was delivered for replacing burned-out bulbs. Each component was small. Each acquisition was separated by days or weeks. Nothing was ever taken in quantities that would be noticed. The theft was distributed across months and across multiple people who didn't know they were participating in radio construction. By August 1944, Weber had accumulated components for a functional shortwave receiver, but components required assembly. Assembly required workspace, tools, and most critically, the ability to work without American observation. The workshop provided workspace. The furniture construction activities provided legitimate reason to be working with wood and tools. The concert hall provided the perfect location for concealment. Weber and 3 assistants, all former signals personnel, worked on the radio during evening hours when workshops were technically closed, but prisoners with special authorization could access them for ongoing projects. They worked slowly. They worked carefully.
They built the radio inside a cabinet that appeared completely ordinary from external inspection. The cabinet was constructed with double walls. The exterior appeared to be simple furniture. The interior concealed sophisticated electronics. The design allowed the radio to be installed in the concert hall as an equipment storage cabinet while actually functioning as a receiver. By September 1944, the radio was operational. It could receive shortwave broadcasts from multiple sources, BBC from London, Armed Forces Radio broadcasting Allied news, even German propaganda broadcasts from Berlin. Testing was conducted carefully. The radio was only operated during times when other camp activities created ambient noise that would mask any sounds. Reception was verified. The device worked perfectly.
Weber later described the first successful reception in testimony preserved in archives. The antenna had been constructed using wire that was already present in the concert hall for legitimate lighting purposes, but had been carefully rerouted to serve dual function. When BBC News came through clearly on the first test, he reported that the operators realized they had achieved something technically sophisticated that American guards had no capacity to detect. The radio provided intelligence that transformed prisoner understanding of the war's progress. British broadcasts reported Allied advances that German propaganda denied. American broadcasts described battles that Berlin claimed as victories but which were actually defeats. The truth about the war's progression became available to German prisoners who were officially cut off from reliable information. But the radio's operators faced an immediate problem. Information was useless if it couldn't be disseminated. They needed distribution networks that wouldn't alert Americans to the radio's existence. The solution was already in place. The camp newspaper. Der Zaun, the Fence, had begun publication in July 1943 as an authorized camp newspaper printed weekly in German language for prisoner readership. American authorities had approved the newspaper with certain conditions. All content would be submitted to censors before publication. No military information would be published. No escape-related content would be included. No criticism of the United States would be permitted. Within those boundaries, prisoners could publish news, cultural content, and recreational information. The newspaper's editorial staff, led by Feldwebel Otto Krebs, who had worked as a journalist for Frankfurter Zeitung before military service, understood immediately that the censorship system could be exploited through careful presentation of information that appeared innocent but conveyed intelligence to informed readers. By September 1944, when the secret radio became operational, Der Zaun had established itself as the primary communication network throughout Camp Crossville and had developed distribution agreements with newspapers in other camps across the United States. Circulation had reached 5,000 copies weekly, with additional readership through sharing and posting in common areas. Krebs developed a system for encoding intelligence from radio intercepts into newspaper content that appeared completely harmless to American censors, but conveyed real information to prisoner readers who understood the encoding system. Sports results were encoded with real military information. An article reporting that the camp soccer team had defeated the team from Barrack 7 by a score of 3-1 might actually be communicating that Allied forces had captured 3 cities in France with 1 German counterattack. The system was simple enough that once explained to readers through word of mouth, anyone could decode the real information. Cultural content contained encoded updates. A review of a concert stating that the performance of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony had been particularly powerful in the second movement might indicate that significant military developments had occurred on the Eastern Front during the second week of the month. Weather reports contained strategic intelligence. An article noting that rain was expected on Tuesday actually communicated information about Allied bombing operations based on a simple code where days of the week corresponded to target categories. The encoding system was sophisticated enough that American censors, even when reviewing content carefully, saw nothing beyond recreational information and cultural commentary. The real intelligence was invisible to anyone who didn't know the code. Krebs later explained the methodology in post-war testimony. The principle was that any content could carry hidden meaning if sender and receiver agreed on interpretation protocols. Americans read the newspaper as recreational content. German prisoners read it as intelligence bulletins. Both readings were correct for their respective audiences. By December 1944, Der Zaun had evolved into a complete news organization that rivaled many civilian newspapers in production quality and content variety. The printing equipment had been gradually upgraded through acquisition of better supplies. The staff had grown to include 15 editors, writers, and production personnel. Distribution networks extended to 17 other camps across the United States through exchange agreements, but the newspaper served purposes beyond information distribution. It maintained German cultural identity in an environment designed to erode it. It provided intellectual stimulation in circumstances of profound boredom. It created purpose for men who otherwise had none. The psychological impact was significant. Prisoners who contributed to the newspaper or who read it regularly reported higher morale and better adjustment to captivity than those who didn't engage with it. The newspaper proved that even in captivity, intellectual life could continue. American camp commanders eventually recognized this benefit. Colonel Martin wrote in his monthly report for January 1945 that the German newspaper had become an effective tool for maintaining camp stability, and that the publication should be supported as beneficial to American security interests. He was correct that the newspaper benefited camp stability. He was incorrect about the full scope of what the newspaper was actually accomplishing. The Camp Crossville Orchestra evolved from informal music practice in mess halls to a full symphony orchestra of 65 musicians performing works of substantial technical difficulty by early 1945. Musical director Hauptmann Klaus Weber who had studied at the Berlin Conservatory before military service and had conducted military bands throughout the European campaign, organized the orchestra according to professional standards that exceeded what most American communities could produce. The orchestra's membership included former professional musicians from German orchestras and opera houses, music students who had been conscripted before completing training, amateur musicians with substantial skill, and dedicated learners who took up instruments while in captivity, specifically to participate in the orchestra. Instruments had been acquired through multiple channels. Some were provided by the YMCA and International Red Cross as part of prisoner welfare programs. Some were purchased using prisoner wages earned from labor. Some were constructed by prisoners using materials available in camp workshops. Some were donated by American civilians who learned about the orchestra through newspaper coverage of the camp. By March 1945, the orchestra's instrument inventory included complete string section with violins, violas, cellos, and double bass, full woodwind section with flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons, brass section including trumpets, trombones, French horns, and tuba, percussion including timpani, snare drum, bass drum, and various auxiliary instruments. The total value of instruments exceeded $15,000, a substantial investment that demonstrated both American willingness to support cultural activities and German determination to create something of quality despite circumstances. The orchestra rehearsed 4 times weekly in the concert hall that prisoners had constructed. Rehearsals were open to any prisoner who wished to attend. Performances were held monthly with American officers, guards, and occasionally local civilians attending as guests. The repertoire was ambitious: Beethoven symphonies, Mozart concerti, Wagner overtures, Brahms chamber works. Music of substantial technical difficulty that required skilled performers and dedicated practice. Performance quality was sufficiently high that American officers who attended concerts expressed surprise that prisoners could produce music of such caliber. Colonel Martin invited a music professor from the University of Tennessee to attend a March 1945 performance and provide professional assessment. The professor's report, preserved in camp archives, stated that the orchestra performed at a level comparable to good regional American orchestras, and that several individual musicians demonstrated professional-level ability. He noted particularly that the discipline and dedication required to achieve such standards while in captivity spoke well of German character and culture. What the professor didn't understand was that the orchestra served purposes beyond music. The weekly rehearsal schedule created predictable patterns of movement and activity that could mask other activities occurring simultaneously. When 65 men were gathered in the concert hall making considerable noise, other prisoners could conduct activities elsewhere that required privacy from American observation. The concert performances created regular events where large numbers of prisoners gathered legitimately, providing opportunity for dissemination of information and maintenance of command structures through interpersonal contact that appeared completely recreational. The orchestra's prestige within camp society provided cover for leadership structures. The musical director and senior orchestra members held positions of respect that translated to influence in camp political dynamics, but appeared to Americans as merely cultural rather than command authority. Most significantly, the orchestra maintained German cultural identity at a time when American authorities hoped to erode prisoners' connection to their homeland. Every performance of Beethoven or Wagner reinforced that German culture was valuable and worth preserving. This cultural maintenance strengthened prisoner resistance to re-education programs that attempted to reshape their worldview. Weber later wrote about the orchestra's deeper purpose. Music was the tool through which we maintained our identity as Germans and as soldiers. The Americans saw concerts. We saw acts of resistance through cultural preservation. Baseball seemed the most American activity that German prisoners could possibly adopt. Yet by summer 1944, Camp Crossville had established an organized baseball league with 8 teams, scheduled games, official statistics, and passionate fan followings. The league's creation stemmed from practical calculation rather than genuine interest in American sports. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, who served as league organizer, later explained the strategic thinking. Americans loved baseball beyond reason. By adopting their sport, we demonstrated willingness to embrace American culture, which reduced suspicion about other activities. The calculation was correct.
American guards responded enthusiastically to German interest in baseball. They provided equipment, offered coaching, attended games as spectators, and reported to superiors that prisoners were successfully adopting American values. Colonel Martin wrote in his July 1944 report that the establishment of an organized baseball league represented remarkable cultural adaptation and demonstrated the effectiveness of humane treatment in transforming prisoner attitudes. He requested additional sports equipment funding based on observed benefits to camp security and morale. What Colonel Martin observed was genuine prisoner engagement with baseball. What he didn't understand was the dual purpose that the baseball league served. The league required extensive organization. 8 teams needed rosters, practice schedules, game schedules,
field assignments, equipment allocation, and statistical tracking. This organizational structure created legitimate need for regular meetings of league officials, team captains, and administrators. These meetings occurred without American supervision because they appeared purely recreational. But meetings that discussed baseball schedules and rule disputes could also discuss other matters that had nothing to do with sports. The league schedule created predictable patterns of prisoner movement and gathering. When 200 prisoners attended a baseball game, their presence at that location was documented and legitimate. This created opportunities for other prisoners to be elsewhere, conducting activities that benefited from reduced American attention. The construction of baseball diamonds required extensive ground modification. Prisoners leveled fields, constructed backstops, built dugouts, and installed drainage systems. This work required tools, provided access to various camp areas, and created infrastructure that had utility beyond baseball. Most significantly, the Baseball League created social networks that transcended barrack assignments and work details. Players and fans from different areas of camp interacted regularly through sports, creating communication networks that appeared completely innocent but facilitated information distribution throughout the prisoner population. By August 1944, the Baseball League had become the most visible prisoner activity in camp. Games drew crowds of 300 to 400 spectators. Statistics were maintained meticulously in the camp newspaper. Rivalries developed between teams that generated genuine emotional investment. American guards attended games regularly, cheering for favorite teams and players. The cultural exchange appeared complete. Germans were learning to love baseball. Americans were teaching them. Both sides benefited from the interaction. What actually happened was more complex. Germans were performing enthusiasm for baseball to maintain American support for activities that served purposes beyond sports. The performance was convincing enough that Americans never questioned its authenticity. Müller later admitted that most prisoners remained fundamentally uninterested in baseball as a sport, but understood its value as a tool. We learned to play baseball adequately and to simulate enthusiasm convincingly. The Americans believed what they wanted to believe.
The educational programs established at Camp Crossville by December 1944 exceeded what many American communities offered their own citizens. Courses were available in English language at multiple proficiency levels, mathematics through advanced calculus, physics and chemistry with laboratory components, engineering principles and applications, business administration and accounting, agricultural science and practice, mechanical skills and repair, electrical systems and maintenance, architectural drawing and design, legal studies and German law, history, literature and philosophy, music theory and performance, art and technical drawing.
Over 1,200 prisoners, more than one-third of camp population, were enrolled in at least one educational program by early 1945. Some were taking multiple courses simultaneously. The more ambitious prisoners were completing curriculum equivalent to university-level education. The education system had been established initially through international Red Cross programs that provided textbooks and materials for prisoner self-improvement. American authorities approved expansion of educational opportunities based on assessment that educated prisoners created fewer disciplinary problems and adjusted better to captivity. By January 1945, the education system had evolved far beyond initial Red Cross programs. Prisoners with professional qualifications served as instructors. Former university professors taught advanced courses in their specialties. Engineers taught technical subjects, lawyers taught legal principles. The teaching quality rivaled many American colleges. Examinations were administered formally with standards equivalent to German university requirements. Prisoners who successfully completed courses received certificates that would be recognized in Germany after the war. The program had become a complete substitute for interrupted university education. But education served purposes beyond credential acquisition. The program created legitimate reason for prisoners to gather in groups for extended periods without American supervision. Study groups met regularly for hours. Americans saw dedicated students. Germans used study sessions to discuss matters that had nothing to do with coursework. The advanced courses required technical materials that had dual-use potential. Chemistry courses needed laboratory equipment and supplies. Engineering courses required mathematical instruments and technical references. These materials, once authorized for educational purposes, were available for other applications. Most significantly, education maintained intellectual discipline and mental acuity in an environment designed to reduce men to routine and boredom. Prisoners who engaged actively with challenging coursework maintained psychological health better than those who didn't. The education system was psychological warfare against the dehumanizing effects of captivity. Lieutenant Werner Schmidt, who completed advanced engineering coursework while imprisoned and later used that education to become a successful civil engineer in post-war Germany, wrote about the education system's deeper value. The courses taught us subjects, but more importantly, they taught us that our minds remained functional, that captivity couldn't reduce us to animals or numbers, that we remained thinking human beings despite circumstances. That knowledge was more valuable than any credential. Despite apparent adjustment to captivity, German prisoners never abandoned their military obligation to escape if possible. Behind the visible activities that Americans encouraged, prisoners maintained sophisticated escape infrastructure that combined traditional tunneling with innovations adapted to American camp conditions. The primary tunnel from Camp Crossville, designated Operation Maulwurf, Operation Mole, was begun in October 1944 and continued actively until liberation rendered it unnecessary in May 1945. The tunnel originated beneath the concert hall, accessed through removable floor panels that had been designed into the building during construction. The location was ideal because musical rehearsals and performances created noise that masked digging sounds, and because legitimate prisoner presence in the hall created continuous cover for men accessing the tunnel. The tunnel design reflected professional engineering knowledge. Former mining engineers and construction specialists planned every aspect. The shaft descended 6 feet to reach depth below frost line and below any surface detection, extended horizontally toward the perimeter fence, following a carefully surveyed route. Incorporated ventilation system using improvised air pumps constructed from available materials. included reinforcement using wood salvaged from shipping crates and construction waste, utilized electric lighting powered by clandestine connection to camp electrical system, and featured shoring techniques that prevented collapse despite soil conditions. Excavation was conducted systematically. Small teams worked in shifts during hours when Americans were unlikely to conduct inspections. Dirt removal was accomplished through carefully planned dispersal. Some dirt was scattered in areas where prisoners conducted agricultural work. Some was mixed into construction waste from legitimate projects. Some was placed in attics of camp buildings through access points that Americans didn't monitor. None was left in obvious piles that would indicate digging activity. By March 1945, the tunnel had extended 150 feet from its origin point and had progressed to within 30 feet of reaching beyond the perimeter fence. At the rate of progress achieved, completion would occur in approximately 6 weeks. The tunnel represented remarkable technical achievement under difficult conditions. Prisoners had constructed a sophisticated underground passage using improvised tools, scavenged materials, and volunteer labor, all while maintaining complete secrecy from American guards who walked above the tunnel daily without suspecting its existence. But the tunnel also represented something more subtle. It maintained military obligation despite apparent cooperation with Americans. Every prisoner knew the tunnel existed, though only a small group actually participated in construction. The knowledge that escape remained possible provided psychological benefit that exceeded any practical value the tunnel might have. Schmidt later explained the tunnel's psychological function. We knew that escape from America offered no realistic possibility of returning to Germany, but we also knew that attempting escape was our military obligation. The tunnel proved that we remained soldiers despite captivity, that we continued to resist despite appearing cooperative. That knowledge was essential to maintaining our identity. The tunnel was never completed. Germany surrendered in May 1945 before the tunnel reached beyond the fence. When American authorities discovered the tunnel during post-surrender inspections, they expressed amazement at its sophistication and scale. Colonel Martin wrote in his final camp report that the tunnel represented remarkable engineering accomplishment and that the fact of its construction under close supervision demonstrated that German prisoners had maintained military discipline and organization despite American belief that such structures had been dismantled. He was correct. The Americans had controlled the camp's surface. Germans had controlled everything beneath. What American authorities failed to recognize throughout the war was that German military command structures never actually disappeared, despite American attempts to dismantle them.
Geneva Convention required that prisoners be separated from their officers to prevent continuation of military authority. American policy went further, attempting to eliminate all military hierarchy by mixing ranks, assigning prisoners to work details that broke up unit cohesion, and punishing any prisoner who attempted to exercise military authority over others. These policies failed completely. German prisoners maintained command structures that were invisible to Americans but completely functional within prisoner society. The system operated through informal authority rather than formal rank. Prisoners who had held command positions before capture maintained authority not through titles but through respect from other prisoners. Commands were transmitted through requests rather than orders.
Discipline was maintained through social pressure rather than military punishment. The result was command structure that functioned effectively while appearing to Americans as merely social dynamics among prisoners who happened to defer to certain individuals because of personal respect. Oberst Friedrich Weber, the senior German officer at Camp Crossville, never wore insignia indicating his rank and never issued orders in American presence. But every German prisoner in camp understood that Weber was the commanding officer and that his guidance carried the weight of military authority. Weber exercised command through the various organizational structures that Americans had approved. He served as musical director of the orchestra, which gave him legitimate authority over 65 musicians. He served as advisor to the camp newspaper, which gave him influence over camp communications. He served as administrator of the education program, which gave him contact with hundreds of students. These civilian roles provided cover for military command. Americans saw a music director organizing concerts. Germans saw their commanding officer issuing guidance through cultural activity. The command structure maintained military discipline without American recognition that discipline existed. Prisoners who violated community standards faced social sanctions that were more effective than any American punishment could be. Exclusion from activities, loss of trading privileges, assignment to undesirable work details through manipulation of volunteer systems, these informal punishments maintained order without American intervention. Most significantly, the command structure maintained military identity despite American attempts to transform prisoners into civilians. Every prisoner understood that he remained a soldier under command, that his obligation to military discipline continued despite captivity, and that the apparent dissolution of hierarchy was performance for American benefit. Weber later described the command methodology in post-war interviews. "We never abandoned military structure, we simply made it invisible. Americans saw prisoners organizing recreational activities. We saw soldiers maintaining unit cohesion through adapted means." Both observations were accurate, but described different realities. By early 1945, Camp Crossville had developed a sophisticated internal economy that operated through barter and a prison currency system based on cigarettes as standard units of exchange. The economy emerged from the combination of prisoner wages earned through labor, goods available for purchase at camp canteens, items received through Red Cross packages, materials accessible through work details, and services provided by prisoners with specialized skills. Cigarettes became currency because they possessed ideal monetary characteristics. They were standardized. Each cigarette was essentially equivalent in value. They were portable, easy to carry and transfer. They were divisible. Packs could be broken into individual units. They were durable enough for transaction purposes, and they had intrinsic value. Smokers genuinely wanted them. Exchange rates were established through market dynamics. A German-language newspaper cost 2 cigarettes. A haircut cost 3 cigarettes. A repaired watch cost 10 cigarettes. More complex services commanded higher prices. Skilled labor was particularly valuable. Tailors who could alter clothing earned substantial income. Cobblers who repaired shoes had continuous work. Artists who created portraits had waiting lists of customers. These skilled workers accumulated wealth measured in cartons of cigarettes. The economy included credit systems. Prisoners could borrow cigarettes with agreement to repay with interest. Default on debts resulted in social sanctions that were more effective than any legal enforcement. Reputation for reliability became essential to economic participation. Some prisoners became wealthy by prison camp standards. Obergefreiter Hans Schneider, a tailor from Munich, accumulated over 200 cartons of cigarettes, equivalent to 4,000 individual cigarettes, through clothing alteration services. This wealth translated to substantial power within camp society because Schneider could purchase almost anything available and could extend credit that created obligations. The economy facilitated construction projects like the secret radio. Components could be purchased from prisoners who worked details where such items were accessible. The payment was cigarettes rather than American currency. The transaction appeared as normal prisoner trading rather than suspicious conspiracy. American authorities were aware that prisoner trading occurred but viewed it as harmless recreation. Colonel Martin wrote that the internal economy demonstrated prisoner initiative and adaptation to circumstances. He saw no security implications in prisoners exchanging cigarettes for haircuts. What he didn't recognize was that the economy created alternative command structures based on wealth rather than military rank, that economic networks distributed information more effectively than official channels, and that the system demonstrated prisoner capability to organize complex institutions without American approval or oversight. The economy proved that prisoners weren't merely surviving captivity, they were building functional society with its own rules, values, and power structures, and they were doing it in plain sight of guards who saw trading but didn't recognize civilization. The Camp Theatre Group, established in November 1943, evolved by 1945 into a professional quality company producing plays that rivaled many American community theatres. Productions included classical German works by Goethe and Schiller, contemporary plays from pre-war German theatre, comedies and farces for entertainment, original works written by prisoners, and even adapted American plays translated into German. The theatre group maintained permanent company of 40 members, including actors, directors, set designers, costumers, technical crew, and support staff. Productions occurred monthly, with performances attended by 300 to 500 prisoners and occasionally by American officers and local civilians. Set design and construction reached remarkable sophistication. Prisoners built elaborate sets using materials scavenged from work details and camp waste. Costumes were created through modification of prisoner uniforms, donated civilian clothing, and fabric acquired through trading networks. The quality of productions impressed Americans who attended. A local newspaper review of a March 1945 production of Goethe's Faust noted that the performance demonstrated remarkable artistic achievement and suggested that several cast members possessed professional theatrical training. The review was correct. Several company members had worked in German theatre before the war. They brought professional standards to camp productions that transformed what could have been amateur entertainment into genuine art. But the theatre served purposes beyond entertainment. The company's need for materials created legitimate reason to acquire items that had dual-use potential. Electrical equipment for stage lighting could be adapted for other purposes. Tools for set construction could be used for projects unrelated to theatre. Rehearsals provided cover for meetings that appeared to be about theatrical production but could discuss other matters. A gathering of 15 prisoners discussing scene blocking could also discuss camp politics, intelligence from the secret radio, or coordination of tunnel work. Most significantly, theatre maintained cultural connection to Germany at a time when American re-education programs attempted to convince prisoners that German culture was inherently militaristic and evil. Every production of Goethe or Schiller demonstrated that German culture included profound artistic achievement that deserved preservation. Lieutenant Otto Becker, who directed theatre productions and later worked in German theatre after repatriation, explained the cultural resistance function. Americans wanted us to believe that everything German was tainted by Nazism. The theatre proved that German culture existed independent of politics, that Goethe and Schiller represented values worth preserving. Every performance was an act of cultural defiance disguised as entertainment. The full scope of prisoner infrastructure only became clear to American authorities in the months following Germany's surrender in May 1945. During post-surrender inspections conducted as camps prepared for prisoner repatriation, American officers discovered the secret radio concealed in the concert hall cabinet, the escape tunnel extending 150 feet beneath the camp, extensive trading networks that operated as complete economic systems, encoded intelligence distribution through the camp newspaper, and dual-purpose infrastructure throughout facilities prisoners had constructed. Colonel Martin's final report, submitted in July 1945, acknowledged systematic failure to understand what prisoners had actually been doing behind the appearance of cooperation. The report stated that German prisoners had maintained military organization and discipline throughout captivity, despite American belief that such structures had been dismantled, that they had constructed sophisticated communications and escape infrastructure while appearing to focus on recreational activities, that they had built a complete parallel society that operated according to German military principles, despite American control of the camp's physical perimeter. The report concluded with remarkable honesty. We controlled the wire. The Germans controlled everything inside it. We saw cooperation and cultural adaptation. They maintained military resistance through means we never recognized as resistance. The failure of understanding was complete and systematic. Other camp commanders reported similar discoveries. At Camp Alva, Oklahoma, inspectors found 3 separate escape tunnels, 2 hidden radios, and an internal discipline system that had operated throughout the war without American knowledge. At Camp Hearn, Texas, authorities discovered that prisoners had maintained complete military command structures that functioned invisibly throughout captivity. The pattern was universal. At every major camp, American authorities discovered after the war that prisoners had maintained organization, discipline, and resistance despite appearing to cooperate fully with American authorities. Intelligence assessments conducted after these discoveries tried to explain the systematic failure. One report noted that American cultural assumptions about individual freedom prevented understanding of how German military culture functioned through collective obligation rather than personal choice. Americans assumed that removing formal command structures would eliminate military organization. Germans simply adapted command to work through informal networks that Americans couldn't recognize as military hierarchy. Another report identified the fundamental assumption failure. Americans believed that humane treatment would transform prisoners into peaceful civilians who abandoned military identity. Germans maintained military identity while performing civilian cooperation. The performance was so convincing that Americans never suspected that cooperation was strategic rather than sincere. The most sophisticated analysis came from Colonel William Shoemake, who had served as intelligence officer responsible for POW affairs throughout the war. His assessment, preserved in archives, stated that the American failure stemmed from projecting American values onto German prisoners rather than understanding German military culture on its own terms. Americans valued individual choice and assumed prisoners wanted to abandon military life. Germans valued collective loyalty and maintained military obligation even when it would have been easier to abandon it. The cultural translation failure was complete. Americans and Germans interacted for 3 years while operating from fundamentally incompatible assumptions about what cooperation and compliance actually meant. Between May 1945 and March 1946, over 370,000 German POWs held in American camps were processed for repatriation to Germany. The repatriation revealed the full scope of what prisoners had built during captivity. They carried with them diplomas from educational programs equivalent to university degrees, musical instruments purchased with prisoner wages, manuscripts of newspapers that had documented their captivity, photographs and programs from theatrical productions, sports equipment from baseball leagues that had taught them American culture, and most importantly, psychological resilience built through maintenance of military and cultural identity, despite circumstances designed to erode both. Many prisoners departed with genuine respect for American treatment, despite having resisted American authority throughout captivity. The paradox was real. They appreciated humane conditions while maintaining opposition to captors. They respected American culture while preserving German identity. Both positions were simultaneously true without contradiction. Oberst Weber, the senior officer from Camp Crossville, gave a final statement before departure that was recorded by American officials. He stated that Americans had treated German prisoners more humanely than Germany had treated many of its own citizens, that the educational opportunities, cultural programs, and humane conditions had exceeded Geneva Convention requirements and demonstrated American values,
but that none of this humane treatment had succeeded in transforming German prisoners into Americans or had eliminated their military loyalty and obligation to resist captivity through all available means. The statement captured the fundamental dynamic that Americans never fully understood. Prisoners could genuinely appreciate American treatment while simultaneously maintaining complete commitment to resisting American authority. The two positions weren't contradictory, they were different aspects of the same military professionalism. Many prisoners who had built the shadow civilization behind barbed wire eventually returned to America as immigrants in the 1950s. They brought with them skills developed during captivity, engineering knowledge from tunnel construction, organizational ability from managing camp activities,
English language proficiency from education programs, understanding of American culture from baseball leagues and newspaper censorship. Miller, who had organized the baseball league as strategic performance, later wrote that the irony wasn't lost on him that skills developed while resisting American authority became valuable when he chose to immigrate to America years later. The baseball he had learned as camouflage actually helped him integrate into American society when he genuinely wanted to belong. Schmidt, who had helped construct the secret radio while appearing to focus on furniture making, became an electrical engineer in post-war America using education he had developed partly while imprisoned. He later reflected that the technical skills used for resistance proved more valuable than he could have imagined when captivity ended. The men who had built orchestras and theaters and newspapers and baseball leagues and escape tunnels and secret radios, all while appearing to cooperate fully with American authorities, had demonstrated something profound about human nature under constraint. You cannot imprison the mind, you cannot confine culture, you cannot contain the human need to build and create and maintain identity despite circumstances designed to reduce people to numbers and routines. The barbed wire contained bodies. It never contained the civilization that prisoners built inside it. The story of what German POWs built behind American barbed wire reveals truths about human nature, military culture, and the limits of control that extend far beyond World War II. First truth: people will create civilization anywhere. Given tools, materials, and time, determined humans will build social structures, cultural institutions, economic systems, and communication networks, regardless of circumstances. Captivity doesn't eliminate the civilizing impulse, it redirects it. Second truth: humane treatment doesn't equal compliance. Americans believed that treating prisoners well would transform them into cooperative civilians. Germans accepted humane treatment gratefully while maintaining complete military discipline and resistance. The two responses weren't contradictory. They represented different aspects of the same professionalism. Third truth: visible cooperation can mask invisible resistance. The orchestras, newspapers, baseball leagues, and educational programs that Americans encouraged all served dual purposes that Americans never recognized. Every approved activity became infrastructure for purposes that went far beyond entertainment. Fourth truth: culture is more powerful than coercion. American attempts to re-educate prisoners failed completely despite 3 years of effort. German cultural identity was maintained and strengthened through activities that appeared to demonstrate cultural exchange, but actually reinforced German identity through preservation of language, music, literature, and values. Fifth truth: you cannot control what you don't understand. Americans projected their own cultural values onto German prisoners, and therefore never understood what they were actually observing. They saw baseball and assumed Americanization.
Germans saw strategic performance. Both observations were accurate but described incompatible realities. The men who built secret radios while appearing to build furniture, who maintained military command structures while appearing to organize recreational activities, who constructed escape tunnels while appearing to accept captivity. These men proved that the human spirit remains free even when the body is confined. The barbed wire was real. The guards were real. The confinement was real. But inside that confinement, prisoners built something that no amount of wire could contain, a complete civilization that operated according to principles they chose rather than rules imposed upon them. That was their victory, not escape, not resistance through violence.
But the creation and maintenance of human culture and dignity, despite circumstances designed to reduce them to mere survival. The orchestras played Beethoven, the newspapers published intelligence, the baseball teams performed enthusiasm, the radios received truth, the tunnels proved obligation, the education system maintained minds, the theatre preserved culture. And through it all, the Americans who controlled the perimeter never understood that they controlled only the perimeter. Everything inside the wire belonged to the prisoners who built it. That was the real triumph of German POWs in American captivity. Not that they resisted, but that they built. Not that they refused to cooperate, but that they cooperated strategically while maintaining complete autonomy over what mattered most: their identity, their culture, their dignity, and their determination to remain fully human despite circumstances designed to reduce them to numbers. The barbed wire contained their bodies. It never touched their civilization.